Hello and welcome to Women's Atheists Unloaded here on Skeptic Haven. I am your host, RIon. Today, we are going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, the divine feminine, the mother goddess that came before the god, Asherah. My guest is Ed Dodge, author of A History of the Goddess from the Ice Age to the Bible. And he's going to be joining me to help reveal some secrets in the Bible and archaeology about the goddesses from Canaan. So stick around.
I don't ever slow up, no I don't take sh**. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take sh**. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take sh**. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement.
Everything I do so instinctive and so passionate. Every word I move so descriptive like an adjective. I got a vendetta against people who patented being negative when you should be getting after it. I got facts over tracks, this and that.
Hey, Ed, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Ryan. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I've been waiting to have somebody to talk to about Asherah and all the goddesses from Canaan. So it's about time I can get geeked out with somebody and dive into this stuff.
Well, I mean, yeah, I've been watching your videos too, so it's great to have someone to talk to that's actually as interested as I am.
Oh yeah, very interested. So what made you want to write this book? Because so far I'm digging it. I'm really digging it. I just got it, and I'm already at chapter 10.
Great. I really stumbled into the story. I had an itch to write a book, just it's sort of like a bucket list thing to do. But I was digging in. It's actually about other stuff. I mean, it was all the cannabis stuff is how I got started. I was looking at cannabis in the Bible, and which is
my cannabis.
So that's a whole part of the story, and trying to figure out how it went from being sacred to not being sacred. And I figured there was some moment in history when that must have happened, that I could be able to figure that out. And it was when I was doing that research that I started learning about how modern scholars are talking about Asherah and the wife of God. And I was like, what the heck are they talking about? Because I'd grown up going to church. I'd grown up going to Protestant Presbyterian church, like all K through 12. I went to Sunday school. My parents weren't super religious, but we went to church. Like, my grandparents went there. We grew up going to that church. And then I also went to Catholic high school. So I was getting church 6 days a week when I was a teenager. And I had never heard of Asherah ever. I had never heard not one mention, much less that she was a wife of God. And I was like, how does that doesn't even make any sense at all. Like, I can't even wrap my head around theologically, where does it fit? Like, because God is all encompassing. So like, God is everything. So how does he have a wife? Where does she fit in? What does that mean? I was totally baffled by the whole thing. So I got back to like reading the Bible, which I hadn't read the Bible. Like at 18, I decided I wasn't a Christian anymore. I'd pretty much had enough. So I didn't raise my kids going to church. I was pretty secular, but I was never an atheist, and I was always interested in comparative religion. So I always studied the Hindus and stuff. And so I was always like interested in spirituality and religion, but I just didn't call myself a Christian. But I broke out all my old Bible study, and now it's totally different. In the 21st century, on the internet, you don't have to go to musty old libraries to find this stuff, and you can pull it all down at once, and you can read the foreign languages. Like the Bible's all translated. You can go to BibleHub.com and have 6 translations side by side, where you can click on it, go right back to the Hebrew, do word searches in Hebrew. I mean, the tools are amazing because like I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but like I could use the computer tools to do all sorts of, quirky research. So basically I just was word searching Asherah, and then the Kadesha are the priestesses. Once I figured out about the Kadesha, then I was word searching about them, and figuring out, just trying to piece together all the places where the goddesses are mentioned. So there's 2 that are mentioned by name, Asherah and Astarte. But Astarte is always either called, she's almost never called Astarte. She's called Ashtaroth, which is plural, or she's called Ashtoreth. And the ETH means shame. She's shameful Astarte. And so why is she shameful? Because she's the goddess of sex and beauty and prostitution and all this ritual prostitution they were doing, because they literally celebrated women's sexuality because they had matriarchal bloodline. So when it's matriarchal bloodlines, it doesn't matter if the father and the sperm donor are two different people. And so the women weren't monogamous, and the entire culture, the entire society is not monogamous. This is what they're fighting about. So anyway, I could do all this quirky research, and I just like put the story together, and it's all First Temple. It's like from Abraham up until the exile, because basically they're polytheistic the entire First Temple period historically. This is like the historical nature.
Admitted.
When it was actually there, when on that first temple on the Temple Mount, whether, however you want to debate what was actually there was something going on in Jerusalem. I mean, they were living in Jerusalem. It's real history. King David took Jerusalem at 1006 BC. That was history. And they were living there, and there was a first temple, and it was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586. Like, that's history. We know it from Babylonian records. We know that they came. We know that the Assyrians marched on Jerusalem, and we know the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. That's all actual history. So those cultures, though, both Judah and Israel, they're not monotheistic. They're totally pagan. The entire culture is completely pagan. And Yahweh is just one God among many gods, and they're fighting it out over a culture war. And it's a reformation they're having. And Baal was the existing incumbent king of the gods. Baal is the Zeus of the Canaanites, but he's the big bad guy in the Old Testament, because Yahweh is competing with Baal to become the king of the gods, at least for their people, because Baal represents all these ugly traditions they don't like, some of which are pretty bad because the child sacrifice was reality.
Right.
But
Some of the
Baal
bad
people
shit we could leave. We could do without.
Actually, I'm not down to go be a Baal worshiper myself. He's a pretty gnarly god when you get into his story. So anyway, they're pagan culture. It's totally pagan. This whole notion that they were Jews in the first temple, or that Abraham is the first Jew, none of that's true.
No,
Abraham is not a Jew.
Not even
They're
close.
Hebrews. The Hebrews are not Jews. The Hebrews are a pagan culture. They're Hebrews and they're Israelites. But they were not monotheistic. The whole concept of monotheism happens after the first temple is destroyed, and they're in the exile in Babylon. And they're in Babylon for quite a while before they really get back for the second temple. And that's when they write the Torah. That's when they put together the script. The final edition of the Torah that we read today that becomes our Old Testament, that's completed in the 5th century BC,
Right.
presumably by Ezra. And they bring it back to Jerusalem for the second temple. And then they're Jews. And then they're monotheists. And then they have rabbis.
They go through all the redactions first.
But they say, we're told that Moses wrote the Torah. That's nonsense. Moses didn't write the Torah. They didn't have the Torah in the first temple. If we went back in time to the first temple, we would be shocked. We wouldn't recognize what they were doing. They totally have a mother goddess in the temple. They have the Kadesha priestesses and the transgender priests in the temple. They're having sex rituals. They're smoking
dressing
ganja.
like men. Men are dressing like men. Women.
They're burning ganja as incense. It's all this sex and drugs and music and dance, and it's a fertility religion. And they're having a fight. They're having a culture war, and it's a reformation. Yahweh is a reform God. He's trying to put a halt to, Moses introduces Yahweh as a reformer, and so they're trying to put a halt to some of these things. They want to put a halt to child sacrifice. They want to put a halt to, they want to lock the women down, put the priestesses out of business, including all the sex rituals, because they're trying to institute patriarchal families, because the default was matriarchal families. And they'd been having, this is what my new book is going to be all focused on, this new information that I didn't know before, that the default for human tribal cultures, indigenous peoples, is matriarchal. Where you track your bloodlines, mother-daughter, not through father-son, because when it's father-son, then you've got to control the women's sex lives. You've got to keep the women locked down. But when it's indigenous peoples, they have maternal bloodlines. And so they have husbands and stuff, but they're not all hung up on all this monogamy thing. And if the husbands, and then you see this in the old stories, and you see it in terms of when people, the other part of it is the marriage traditions in the tribal cultures. When they get at a wedding, if the man goes and lives with the woman's family, that's a matriarchal marriage. And then
Samson.
Right, exactly. Samson, and there's a bunch of characters who go live with the women. Jacob does. When Jacob, who's Israel, he goes and he's got 4 babies with 4 different women that make the 12 tribes of Israel. That's a matriarchal family. He's living there with the sisters, and the sisters are telling him who to sleep with. You're going to sleep with her tonight. You're going to sleep with me tonight, and you're going to make me a baby. You're going to make me a family. It's a matriarchal family.
And babies too, because I
What's
believe I know what scripture you're talking about. It's the women who are naming the children, like when they're
the
having
way
these
they train
babies.
children?
I'm the one
Exactly. Yep.
naming. Yeah. Sorry.
Yep.
Just wanted to
That's
interject that
another
too.
detail. That's exactly part of it. But like, it's anytime you see where the royalty passes through the daughters, and this is, you see it in the Greek literature. You see this with Helen of Troy. When Helen of Troy in the Iliad, you know that whole story when gets absconded.
Kind of.
Anyway, the reason why they need to go run down Helen of Troy and bring her back is because she was the key to the throne. Her husband, who became king, who was upset by her running off, he had become king by marrying her. She was the royalty. Her parents were the royal ones.
The bloodline.
And also, and the same thing with the other men, Odysseus and Agamemnon, all the kings in that story all become kings by marrying the women who were the royal queens, because that's an older culture. Anyway, that's a side story. That's also going to be in the book, where I parallel the Greek and the Old Testament because they're totally contemporary with one another. And
there's
as far
a lot
as
of
matriarchal versus patriarchal, they're both doing the same thing. They're both forcing their society into a patriarchal mode when it had previously been matriarchal. And so this is a big thing of what they're fighting about. So anyway, that's all a bit of a ramble right there. We can talk about something specific.
What I would love to talk about is maybe, I do hear a little bit of an echo coming. I hear myself on your end. I don't know where it's coming from, but what I would love to talk about.
Hold on.
It is on my end, Kat. I'm not sure what it is.
If I turn down that speaker, is that better?
That might be. I don't hear it now. Do you hear it, Kat? Well, what I would like to talk about is we were talking backstage about the Bronze Age collapse, and because that's important for the landscape, showing how at one point we had the land of Canaan who are like vassals to Egypt.
I
so
screwed up my audio here. I just missed what you were saying.
Oh, that's okay. I was just saying that it's
Bronze Age
important.
collapse, and then on my end I cut you off, but I'm back. Sorry.
The land of Canaan. So at one point they're vassals to Egypt. So there's a lot of influence of, what Egyptian religion.
Collapse is absolutely the backdrop of the whole. That's where Moses steps into the story. So to step farther back to Abraham, with Abraham and them going into Egypt and then becoming slaves. Is that better?
Yeah, I think it's good.
That all tracks with Egyptian history from like the 1800 BC to like 1200 BC. With the Hyksos, and then that all tracks with Egyptian history, and like you can sort of place the Semitic peoples, not necessarily the Hebrews by name, but there's like pretty good evidence that like what's going on in the whole length of the story is at least tracking the historical backdrop. My whole thing is that these are myths and legends and propaganda, but they're all drawn from actual historical events, and that's the whole thing from Abraham right on through tracks with history. And so they're in Egypt, and we have evidence of Semitic peoples working as forced labor in those same cities. And so then you get to the Bronze Age collapse. And this is where I think the Exodus happens. The first identification of everyone, so the Christian fundamentalists will tell you that the Exodus is like 1400 BC, 1450 BC, but all the scholars push it 200 years forward to like 1250 BC. And so the Christian fundamentalists hate that, and they debate this, and they're always still looking to do their own archaeology and scholarship for the older dating. But the scholarship is actually pretty good, I think. And so the scholars will place it mid 1200s BC. I actually think that the very first mention of Israel anywhere in archaeology is what's called the Meneptah Stele, and that's from like 1208 BC, around there. And that is a victory stele by the pharaoh Meneptah. And this is the first set of battles that is the beginning of the Bronze Age collapse. He has a big war against the Sea Peoples, and then he goes on a victory. Then he goes marching through Canaan. Now the Egyptians had at this point been ruling Canaan with an iron fist for centuries, for like 400 years. The whole land of Canaan, right up through today's Syria and everything, was under control. And then north of that was part of the Hittite Empire out of Turkey. So the Hittite Empire came from the south, and the Egyptian Empire came north, and around Lebanon or so is where, around Phoenicia, I think around Ugarit is where the border was. So Egypt or Canaan was under firm Egyptian control. There's this big war, though, but now the Bronze Age collapse has happened. There's droughts and famines and earthquakes and civil unrest, and people are starting to leave the Aegean. And so the Sea Peoples are this big marauding group. We don't really know exactly who they are, but they are on one hand migrants being forced out of wherever they were, probably because of a drought, but they're also like they're armed, and they're like trying to fight their way in to take a place to live, and they're probably Mycenaeans, at least in part. And the Mycenaeans are the people from the Trojan War that I was just mentioning, Helen of Troy and Agamemnon. That whole cast of characters are Mycenaeans, and they leave Greece in the Bronze Age collapse, and the Greece goes into a 300-year dark age, and then the Hellenistic Greeks that we know as ancient Greece, they come in after like a 300-year period. So there's this. But the Mycenaeans leave Greece and they become the Philistines. So they're actually relevant to the story because they're matriarchal. They have these matriarchal family traditions, as we were mentioning with Samson before.
Right.
So the Sea Peoples they attack. So we know this for a fact. The Sea Peoples attack Egypt in 1208 or whatever, 1210 BC, whenever they right around in there. But the Egyptians managed to fight them off. And Menorpta has this victory stele, but Egypt is really weakened by this. And the Sea Peoples don't really go away. But also on this victory stele is a mention of the very first mention of Israel ever. And it says something to the effect of, it describes them as a people, not as a land, first of all. It's only one line. And then it says, we wiped them out. Their seed is no more.
Seed is laid waste, yeah.
Their seed is laid waste, right? This is a famous piece of archaeology. I could pull up I don't have any of the graphics, but I have, I could give you the graphics. And then it's about 40 years later, though, that the Sea Peoples attack again. This is 1177. This is when Professor Klein has his book, 1177, the year civilization collapsed. This is also when the Sea Peoples attack the Egyptians for a second time. And this time, and they're coming, there's a really famous archaeology with all these big battle scenes, and the Sea Peoples are coming with their families. Like they're coming with wagons with women and children and oxen and their animals, and they're like trying to move to Egypt. And they have a huge war. It goes on, I think, for a couple of years. And again, the Egyptians are able to fight them off, but now Egypt is really weakened. And this is when Egypt's hold on Canaan starts to break down. And this is when the Philistines, the Moabites, the Edomites, and the Israelites all move in. It's all at the exact same moment after this big war. And so the archaeologists have dug up these hilltop settlements and where the Israelites started living and Israelite writing and all this stuff. And they know it's Israelite. And they weren't eating pig, for one thing. The Israelite settlements, they're kosher, or like they weren't eating pork even back then. And so the neighboring peoples are eating pig animal bones, and the Israelite settlements have no pig bones. And these hilltop settlements are like, they're not the nicest places to live. They're not like the favorable land for growing.
And this is like the shepherding. These are the shepherding peoples who are.
Also, it's a totally lawless breakdown of civilization. And so it's a totally lawless time. They're living on the hilltops because they can defend themselves. They're building walls up there. And these are places where they can defend themselves, because now you get into. So now we're into the Bronze Age collapse, and it's like a 200-year dark age. All of the dominant powers have broken down. Egypt has to like pull back and just deal with their internal things. The Hittite Empire is completely broken down. The only group that's surviving are the Phoenicians in Tyre. They managed to hold on, but everybody else, like their cities are sacked and burned. The kings are all killed off. It's just tribalism and everybody onto their own. And so it's like that for 200 years, complete breakdown of trade, a complete breakdown in writing, a completely lawless through the entire Mediterranean basin. And this in the timeline. So I think that this is now we're in the book of Judges, but back to the Exodus. I think the Menorpta stele simply is the Exodus. I think that it's two sides of the story. You take the timing works out too. If you take the Israelite, the Bible version of the story, it says, we escaped from Egypt. It was all these dramatic events, and we fled Egypt. And then we escaped Egypt by the skin of our teeth, with the Egyptian army bearing down on us. And only by divine intervention and the grace of God did we escape from Egypt with our lives. But then we were forced to stuck and wander in the desert. Here's the Egyptian side of the story. we wiped out those Israelites. You'll never hear
Right.
from those. You'll never hear from those guys again. We got rid of them. It's, to me, it's just two sides of the same story. And then,
Yeah.
so then where do the Israelites go? Now there's not 600,000 of them or 6 million. I mean, the numbers are all grossly exaggerated.
Right.
But like, did some group of, Semitic slave peoples like bust free out of Egypt? I think it's totally reasonable to think
There was a lot of groups who travel who
yeah,
I mean,
people
that's
are
kind of
like
what they
to
did.
think that there's massive war going on. There's like, they create all these myths and fables and legends around it. But what was the historical backdrop? Is that there's these massive wars going on, a completely civilizational cracking up, chain of events. And so this group of, slaves or whatever, they flee. And they flee, they flee and they escape by the skin of their teeth. And that's what the story's about, right? Like, only by divine intervention, the grace of God, did we barely escape.
Mhm.
And
Their
then on
God.
the victory stele, the Egyptians were like, yeah, we wiped them out. To me, that just sounds like two sides of the same story.
Mhm.
And then it's 40 years basically until the second war when the Sea Peoples go back. And that's when, because the Sea Peoples settle in as the Philistines. They become the Philistines of the Old Testament. And so we know that it's after 1175 that all these people move in. So there's your 40 years. They were wandering in the desert because they couldn't go back to Egypt because they just barely escaped. And they couldn't go forward into Canaan because Egypt was still had control at that point. They don't lose control until
they've
40
got
years
their
later.
garrisons and whatnot set up there still.
No, it's a totally Egyptian controlled region. And so, we know the Israelites come in after 1175. So there's your 40 years. So I think there's the story. And then we're into the book of Judges. And the most interesting thing in the book of Judges, it's not in this book, it's going to be in my new book, is the Song of Deborah. And so, so now we're into the time period between 1175 and then the next big event is 1000 when King David takes Jerusalem. But that entire period between 1175, so 175 years, 100, whatever, a century and a half ish, is this completely chaotic time where it's tribal cultures just hashing it out and just like trying to survive. And that's exactly what they're describing in the book of Judges. All the stories in the book of Judges have fit this context. And so the Song of Deborah, which is like Judges 5, is meant to be the oldest passage in the entire Old Testament. It's from the oral tradition. It's not from, because there's no writing at this time. This is a totally illiterate time period. So everything from this time period is coming from oral tradition. And so the oldest, there's a couple passages that, scholars say are from this oldest time period. And Song of Deborah is one of them. In Song of Deborah, she clearly describes that she's a matriarch. She calls she is a matriarchal character, but she calls the troops to battle, and she is the one who leads the way, and she is the one who is like calling out the forces, saying now it's time to fight and there to go. And she is clearly a matriarch. And this is so these 12 tribes of Israel, such as they were, these were matriarchal tribes, and in Deborah is one of these matriarchs. And then as we go forward, they're going to be fighting the men. As kingship goes forward, the men assert themselves to have patriarchal families and patriarchal, because they had been coexisting for a long time period. The patriarchal had been, I think matriarchal is the default, and then patriarchy rises with the Bronze Age, with the rise of kingship and armies and slavery. And that's when the men start forcing the women into live the way the men want them to live. But they coexist for a long, long time. And they've been coexisting within the Israelite community. And this is what the group of Yahweh is really, really strongly all about. Like they're going to like institute patriarchy once and for all. And so you've got to take out these women, and you got to take out their priesthoods, and you've got to take out their religious traditions, and the whole belief system's got to go. And it takes a long time for that to happen. It doesn't happen like in any one generation. They're fighting about it for centuries. And so let's talk about which gods they've got, though. This is before we go any farther.
Love my
Canaanite
gods.
pantheon is we learn about it from the Ugaritic text. We mentioned it before. Now, Ugarit was a city on the Lebanese coast that collapses, is a part of the Bronze Age collapse. They're one of the many cities that sacked and burned. And they've got this incredible archaeology where
like 1300 or something like that, I think.
Around 1250, 1200. It's in that time period. It's one of these places that were destroyed by the Sea Peoples. And they've got this fantastic archaeology of letters that were being written by the king, like as the as the invading
Right.
boats are
They're
arriving,
at our
and
shores, like they
they're
see
at our
them.
shores. You can see them.
Yeah.
Our troops are away fighting over someplace else. We're undefended. Send help, send help. And then those letters get like, they were like on wet clay, and then as the city was burned, they get hardened in the fires of
It's
like,
amazing.
it's
I mean,
amazing
that's
stuff, man.
kind of like a miracle story, honestly, to think about
For
it, because it could have just
archaeologists, it
been
is.
last a time. But now we have these texts that's enlightened us to so much that was happening between, the land of Canaan and Ugarit. Very similar ideas that they've shared,
And so
obviously.
then we've got the mythology. We find a couple of pieces of mythology, including most
Mhm.
importantly the Baal cycle.
The
And
Bell
this,
cycle is, y'all, you've got to read it, and you can
yeah,
get
people,
there's a
everyone,
free
if you're interested in the
book you can
Bible, you got to read the
find.
Baal cycle.
You
Um,
really should learn all of the Ugaritic myths, because you're going to see a lot of how they're intertwined. There's many of them are, but
It's all
yeah,
the same characters. It's the same
right.
pantheon of gods because the Israelites are Canaanites. They have got the exact same pantheon of gods as everybody else. They just introduced Yahweh as a new character into a pre-existing pantheon. And so we might as well talk about what that pantheon is and like how it's actually a pretty interesting pantheon. Um, I don't talk about all the gods. I'm just going to talk about a handful of them. So
The most important ones: El, Asherah.
El and Asherah are the mother, heavenly father, and the earthly mother. So now they are the parents of all the gods. So now it's important to understand that the God of the Bible is El and Yahweh combined, and their identities merge. And that's why in the English text you read it as the Lord and the word God are two separate words in the Bible. That's because they're referencing two separate gods whose identities were literally stitched together. El is the traditional heavenly father, the creator of the universe, older than time, the father of time, gray bearded guy coming down from the clouds. Pretty nice guy, actually. El is a very kind God,
Yeah,
perfectly friendly. He
he lets
cares about
his
people.
kids do what they need to do. He's kind of like, all
Um,
right, you handle your
and
shit.
like he's a pretty generous character and he's funny. He likes to get drunk and screw and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
he's like a El is cool, man. And so he is the traditional heavenly father. He's been worshipped for thousands of years all over the Near East. In Mesopotamia, they call him An or Anu. He's a very old god. He says got different names because all the Canaanite gods are kind of a blend of they're very similar to the Mesopotamian gods, but they've got some of their own twists. And then they've been syncretized with Egypt. And by this time period, Egypt had been ruling Canaan for a long time. And so there's a huge amount of Egyptian influence and in the Canaanite gods at this time period. So it's not exactly the same as Mesopotamian, but it's got Mesopotamian roots, the same roots as the Mesopotamian pantheon, but then with some of the pretty interesting twists. So El, though, is very clearly the same as An. He's not the same as Ra of the Egyptian. This is important because like Ra of the
Okay.
Egyptian pantheon, who's the creator of the universe, is a very different character than El is. Ra does not have a wife, and there's a whole thing I could go into between El and Ra, or what I think that was the influence on the Bible. But El is clearly not Ra. El is like An from Mesopotamia, from Sumer and Babylon, and his wife is Asherah. We would call her Mother Earth. That's not exactly the term they use. They call it a Lady of the Sea. They're flat earthers
Right.
for one. These people didn't have the notion of a globe. They're
Yeah,
literally
a
were flat
dome,
earthers
flat
and
dome.
covered by a dome. And you'd fall off the earth if you go out on the water.
I wish some
Um,
people would fall off the earth, but anyway. It's
so they
just
don't call her Mother Earth. But for them, the sea, the ocean, is the primordial salt waters, is the source of all life. And they're true. It's actually an accurate biological historical statement. Like the salt waters are the source of all life on Earth. And so they saw that, they recognized that. And so she's the Lady of the Sea. And the oceans were like where they saw the divine feminine. And like in the creation stories, it's always the mother is the salt waters.
right,
So
like
Tiamat is like great
Tiamat.
salt water. She's like a demon, but Namu for the older Sumerian stories is the great salt waters. So that tradition goes around, and so Asherah is Lady of the Sea, Lady of the salt waters. And then together they're the parents of the entire pantheon. Now El, a lot of people say he's the king of the gods. He's not. El is like the grandfather standing above the
Yeah.
pantheon. His son is the king of the gods. Now his son is Baal. Baal is like Zeus. He's the king of the pantheon. And it always annoys me when scholars are like describe Baal as a storm god. It's like, sure, he's a storm god, but you're kind of missing the point if you don't label him as king of the gods. He is the same as Zeus. He is, or the same as Marduk from Babylon, or Enlil from Sumer, or Thor. I mean, he is. Thor and Odin have this relationship. Odin is the grandfather, and he's there and he's respected. He's a part of the story, but his mighty young virile son is the active king. That's how Thor is, and so that's how Baal is. Baal is the king of the gods, and in the Baal cycle, we see his competition with his brothers, Mot and Yam, to become because. And the interesting thing about Baal, Yam, and Mot is that they are matched perfectly with Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, the three brothers that are the chiefs of the Greek pantheon. It's the same scenario in the Canaanite pantheon. Baal is the storm god who's the king. Yam is the god of the sea. And this is also the Hebrew word for sea. So we know that this were the Hebrew people, because this is their darn language. This is their actual words. And same thing with Mot.
Words.
Mot is the god of death, and that's the Hebrew word for death. So like we can say with quite certainty that these are their traditions. So Baal, Yam, and Mot are like Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. And Baal fights with both of them. So like, unlike the Greek traditions, so they have the same characters, but they tell the stories differently. So in the Greeks, El is like Kronos, who was Zeus's father, and Kronos a nasty god, and Zeus had to castrate him and get rid of him, right? Or not castrate him, but he had to get rid of Kronos. He had to do war with the older generation of gods. And he gets along with Poseidon and Hades. But in the Canaanite stories, El's a nice guy, but Baal and his brothers are at each other's throats.
And Yam's a big dick. He's a big dick, and which is why Baal has to handle him.
Yeah. And Yam, he was actually the earlier king of the gods, and Baal had to come along and unseat him. And Asherah kind of liked Yam because he's of the oceans. But
I think she kind of controls him. Looking at some of like the words in the myth, it seems like
detail about this is that the sun is the king of the gods, right? But who makes the decision of who sits on the throne? It's Asherah. Every time it's Asherah. And this parallels indigenous peoples, and at least in Native Americans, they have their chief who's a man, like their war chief of the tribe. But he gets the job, he doesn't inherit the job from his father. He doesn't get it through force of arms or violence. He gets the job because it's a council of women that choose who's going to be the man, which man they want to be their chief. And then the tribe has got to consent to it. And that's how Native Americans practice democracy. But like the chief is nominated, the man chief is nominated by the women. And then when that guy's no good anymore, the women pick a new man. And that's a matriarchal culture. That's an example of matriarchal governance. They still have husbands. They still have, macho men that go out and fight. But the women are have a little more say in what's going on. It's not just violence.
Wisdom is important.
Wisdom is important. So you see this going on in the Baal cycle. It's Asherah who keeps making the decision. El stamps it with his authority, but he always asks her, what do you want? What do you think? Every time. El is always not dissenting, but you go make sure you ask your mother.
Because there's a few times in the story where Baal and Anat have to visit Asherah and ask for her permission, and they got to take her presents in order to get the permission from El. And of course, he acquiesces to whatever it is that she wants, because she's divine. She's wisdom.
He says, go back, ask Asherah if she approves. If she brings your approval, then I'll do it. So, all right. So Baal, Yam, and Mot, those are the big three guy gods, and El. So now let's talk about the goddesses. Now this is where the story gets fun, because this is such a great set of characters. They're really all three of these goddesses are as powerful as any character in any literature I've ever come across anywhere. There is no. All three of these goddesses, Asherah, Astarte, and Anat, are as badass as anybody. So, and the fact that no one knows about them, I want to do graphic novels. This is my goal. Yes. Has always been to turn these stories into graphic novels. That is my long-term goal. If you need any help,
you let me know. I love those badasses. Anat's just killer, man.
So Asherah is, as we explained, she's the mother goddess. Now Asherah is very well respected. Everybody loves her. Everybody comes in and treats and gives her, but she's not like, she's still like the grandmother still kind of figure. It's her daughter, Astarte. She is, in my opinion, the queen of heaven. When they're talking about the queen of heaven in the Bible, to me, it's very clearly Astarte. It's not Asherah. Now, Astarte, she is the same as Ishtar of Babylon and Inanna from Sumer and Aphrodite in Greece and Rome and Venus. And she is the single most popular goddess of the entire Bronze Age. She's the goddess of love and war. She is supremely badass in every possible dimension. She does not submit to any male figure in any realm. She challenges her father. She steals powers from the other gods. Because we don't have that many stories about Astarte, so I mainly lean on the Mesopotamian versions. But every single tradition had a version. They all track with Venus, with the planet Venus, which is the third brightest object in the sky. Right. The morning star and the evening star. It's the brightest object after the sun and the moon. And the evening star and the morning star corresponds to love and war. Like daytime is for fighting and nighttime is for loving. And these two sides of everything, and male and female and transgenderism, that's all part of it. And all these transgender priests are all like worshiping Astarte. She is herself as transgender. She'll turn into a man in battle. And so she is, so she's a warrior goddess, and she totally kicks ass in battle, but she's also a goddess of divination and wisdom and prophecy. But she's also this famously promiscuous sex goddess, and the courtesan of the gods. And she is herself a prostitute. And no one talks about this. The scholars these modern day feminists don't know how to deal with this conversation that the single most popular deity, or at least goddess, of the entire Bronze Age for 3,000 years is a porn star. By our standards, she is like Jenna Jameson, man. She is a freaking hot to trot porn star, putting her raw sexuality on display.
She owns it.
She totally owns it. And so how does that work? Well, clearly they're matriarchal. Clearly they're not worried about who the sperm donors are because when these women get pregnant.
Hell, he might not even be around for long. He's probably going to be dead in battle soon.
I know, right? Honestly. So they've got ritual prostitution, and it's doing it for thousands of years, and it's a fertility religion. So it's all about the goddess is all about the farmers and making the flowers grow. And so they believe that sex makes the flowers grow. And so in terms of just superstitious magic, it's like, all right, everybody, we can't get enough. Orgies for everybody. Come on, grandma. It's I think it's actually
that's a visual.
Public sex rituals, man. I think it's pretty primitive stuff by our standards. But they're totally doing it. And they're definitely having at least the priestesses in the temples where you can go have sex with them. And if these girls get pregnant, it's a virgin birth. And the child didn't have a father, instead of being impregnated by the gods. And this is where we have this as a backdrop in mythology and legend all over the place of these virgin births, and why every hero in every story is always impregnated by the gods, because it was totally normal. It in fact happened all the time. Anytime a girl got pregnant at the temple, she was said to have been impregnated by the gods. It was probably more common than as a cultural motif that it happened all the time.
Fascinating.
So this is and they have abortions too. They've got herbal medicine and midwifery and
right.
And they know their
the Kotharat are the divine midwives who come down with their rituals and their cannabis.
Midwifery is a huge part of the whole thing,
right?
Because it's all cycle of life traditions, and these are all the women are doing the birth and the death and the whole 9 yards of the entire cycle of life, and it's all women's business. And the women are the experts in all of it. So their funeral, there's women in the cemeteries that are professional mourners at funerals, and who will sing and stuff, and there's, the women who do the hospice, and, they've got, the women who are the potion makers, the women who are the midwives, the women who do sex. I mean, sex is just one thing. It's just I don't even want to overemphasize it, but it's a part of the culture, but it's,
so we're seeing a lot of women driven jobs that women have control over.
Weaving Weaving, that's women's business.
Yes.
And it's not some drudgery that they were locked in the back to do. It's industry, it's manufacturing, it's
Yes.
business. And those are women-owned businesses. And so if you've got matriarchal families where the women stay put, when they get married, the husband comes to them. The women are staying put with their family businesses and their intergenerational wealth and all the other women around, their sisters and aunts and stuff to help with the child care. So the women are totally empowered in this tradition. Whereas if the woman goes to live with a man's family and they get divorced, although now the girl's just being kicked to the street with a baby in tow, and the women are totally disempowered. We've got to go live with the man's family. But if you go live with the woman's family, then the women are staying put and they're like always, they're protected that way. And if it's a good man, you keep him around. And if he's a bad man, you send him packing. And so they get divorced, they get marriages, but they get divorced too. And that's what these cultures are. That's what this Canaanite culture is. And but the Israelites are a specific breed of shepherds. And they are, I think, have been patriarchal for a long time because the shepherding peoples are out in the country and they can control their daughters' sex lives much more readily than in the cities. And they have a real rivalry with the people in the cities. Those are the farmers. Cain and Abel are farmers, are a farmer and a shepherd.
There's a lot to that story. There's a very deep.
It's political propaganda. It's farmers and shepherds are city folk and country folk, and the city folk are all these people with their promiscuous sex lives and their matriarchal traditions that they've been hating as far back as Sodom and Gomorrah. In Abraham's time, they hated the people in the cities because Abraham wants to have these patriarchal families, and so. There's a long-standing, that aspect of, I think, is a long-standing, and that there's patriarchal groups that dislike the matriarchal groups and look down on their cultural practices and their, whatever, their promiscuity and what have you. And so, all right. And so then so that's Astarte. Astarte represents all of this female empowerment and sex and all this stuff. And then you've got Anat. Now, Anat is the third piece of the triple goddess. So it's mother, maiden, and death is a repeating motif that we've got all over the world. And
anybody who's pagan would be familiar with the triple goddess motif.
Wicca, modern Wicca, but it's absolutely really old. You see it in ancient Egypt. Triple goddess. It's the daughters of Ra, the three eyes of Ra. I was mentioning Ra. He's the first three goddesses he creates are Bastet, Sekhmet, and the other mother goddess. I forget her name at the moment. Anyway, Sekhmet is the death goddess. And in modern Hinduism, you've got the three that go with Shiva. So you've got Parvati as the mother goddess, and then her avatars are Durga is the warrior maiden, and then Kali. And so Kali is the closest approximation we have to Anat. Anat is the third goddess of, and if you're familiar with Kali, I can show you pictures of her. She's covered in blood. She's got a skull necklace, a belt of human hands. She's holding a severed head, and she is just, the death machine. She is bringing death and destruction. When Parvati gets upset, she turns into Kali, and she just cleanses with her broadsword. She cleanses the countryside. She chops off heads left, right, and center.
Right. I think Anat is called like the Widowmaker. She's like the widower.
And Anat is just like Kali. They call her the Canaanite Kali, except she's a much older character than Kali. But she's described the same way. She has a belt of human hands, a garland skull necklace. She's slathered in blood. And
I need to make that.
And she just delights in slaughter.
Right.
But she's Astarte's best friend and sister, and so they ride into battle together, riding lions. And so Astarte will be like, she'll go with the generals to give them advice. But Anat, she's just going to go in the thick of the mob and like cut down people 10 at a time.
Yeah, she's just delighting. I like that you mentioned it literally says she delights in the blood and in the lust of it. She's just enjoying herself. It's what she does.
Her belly filled with the laughter and like and glory. And she is not some trivial character either. She's not just off on the fringes as a death goddess. She is Baal's consort. She is absolutely central to the entire Baal cycle because this is Baal's wife, or it's his sister, but it's his sister lover. But this is Baal's consort. And so imagine this as a culture, like your queen of the gods is this this Carl
wild
character. I mean,
woman.
she's utterly terrifying. And Bale in the Bale cycle delights in slaughtering people too. He's pretty gnarly.
Right.
The Bale cycle, like when he celebrates his victory, he goes off rampaging around a bunch of towns and kills a lot of people. Him and Anat just go on this rampage. It's like, wow, those are some pretty hardcore gods, man. Like those are not friendly gods at all. And this is a culture that has human sacrifice as like a routine part of it. So I mean, it's a pretty blood-soaked. They're pretty gnarly people, but the Phoenicians are also extremely artistic and sophisticated traders and artisans,
all the
and like
inventions.
so it's this real paradox that on one hand they were some of the most sophisticated people of their era, but on they're the first people to really sail all around the Mediterranean and be trading all over. They were some of the richest people, so they're not an unsophisticated culture, but they've got these really hardcore, crazy ass gods. And so Asherah, Astarte, and Anat are the three goddesses that are in the Old Testament, but only the two of them are mentioned. Asherah is mentioned 40 times. Most of the time it's as a totem pole. The Asherah pole is a carved wooden pole. It's a totem pole, just like Native Americans have. It's a totem pole, and just like indigenous people do. And because these are indigenous traditions. And the altar stands either next to the altar of God, the altar of Baal. There was an Asherah pole inside King Solomon's temple. And then the followers of Yahweh are repeatedly trying to chop it down. So it's always showing up when the Yahwehs try to chop down the Asherah pole. So, but Asherah is mentioned either as a goddess or as an Asherah pole, 40 times. Astarte is mentioned either as plural Ashtaroth or as the shameful Ashtoreth. She's mentioned around a dozen times, but they repeatedly say that King Solomon worshipped her and that King Solomon built a high place for her and that King Solomon is explicitly associated with Astarte. And the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, the one romantic, sexy, lovey-dovey part of the entire Bible is a vestige of these liturgies. Now, scholars will say it's from the Persian time period. I think maybe the language was updated in the Persian time period, but there's no question that it's a liturgy of Astarte. It comes out of these traditions of the Hieros Gamos, the sacred marriage, which is a big holiday and big festival that they had, a big ritual. Because you've got examples of the exact same format of love poetry going all the way back into Mesopotamia, like 1,000 years earlier. So it's clearly sacred Hieros Gamos literature. So that's King Solomon and Astarte. But then Anat, she is never explicitly named.
I love how you mentioned that. I had not caught that, but the fact that you mentioned that they don't put her name in the Bible is kind of suspicious.
It's extremely telling, and I'll tell you exactly why. She does show up as a place name, so we know that there's a character in the Song of Deborah. It's pointed that it's so old that is called son of Anath. There's some guy who's running around Deborah who's son of Anath. And then it shows up in a place name once or twice as well. Anath does something Anath. So we know it's around, and we know from the Ugaritic literature. Now, to be fair, nobody knew this stuff before the Ugaritic literature came out. And that stuff has only been published in our lifetime. So it's all like new information. I mean,
and thank goodness.
When you're taking the Ugaritic Baal cycle and plugging that into the Old Testament as, thank you, J-Dub. I appreciate it, guys. Anyone buying the book, I greatly appreciate it. Anybody who so the Ugaritic text, to plug that into the Old Testament story and recognize that this is like a related literature, and not just tangentially, it's like these are the same characters. Like this is the religion of Baal. Like this is what they're talking about. This is what they were reading. And when they go and smash the temple of Baal at various points in the story, in the Old Testament story, well, like now we're seeing what the Baal religion was, and you can judge it for yourself. Like maybe there's a good reason why they smashed the temple of Baal. Maybe there's a perfectly good, maybe it was a perfectly justified political cause that the religion of Baal really was this nasty, blood-soaked, pretty ugly religion where, these
they needed
really
a reform
gods sacrificing babies. Like they really were doing that stuff. So
Even I wanted to mention, just since you mentioned the similarities, even like the epithets of Yahweh, how he takes on attributes that are like rider of the clouds. Baal's
Yeah,
called
no,
rider
he's
of the
stealing.
clouds,
Yeah,
but
he's deliberately
just
stealing
taken.
the throne, man. Like you got to steal. Like I'm gonna pull the cloak off your shoulders. I'm gonna grab myself. I'm gonna grab that crown off your head.
Yoink.
I'm gonna put it on. I'm gonna kick you off of your throne, and I'm gonna sit in the throne, and I'm gonna take all the titles for myself. That's exactly what's happening. But just understand that Baal was really old at this point. Baal had been around for
Mhm.
some time, and Yahweh is the young upstart. Um,
But
so
those
there's
things
one
are
thing about
important because people recognize it. Because when they hear that epithet, they know, oh, okay, that was Baal, and now this is Yah. Well, damn, he must be pretty
exactly.
powerful. Sorry, I didn't mean to
Yeah,
interrupt
anytime a
there.
new king comes along, he gets the titles of the old king. A new pharaoh comes along, he takes on all the old titles, and of a new
Right.
pope, he's got the same titles as the old pope, right? Because the old pope is dead and gone. And I'm the pope now. I'm the,
Right.
so such and such Pontifex Maximus, So now I'm
Yes.
the rider on the storms. Get rid of that chump. He can't ride no clouds. I got the clouds.
I could do that.
I'm the
Yeah.
one. Back to Anat though. Let's go back to in the Baal cycle. So Baal defeats his brother Yam in battle, and then he wants to have a temple built for himself. So they got to go ask permission. So Baal goes off with his consort Anat to ask from, we were mentioning, asking permission of El and Asherah. And so when Baal comes up respectful, they go to visit El first. Baal's all nice and respectful, but how does Anat go and talk to El?
I will
She
make
says,
your
give me
beard
what I
run
want,
red
or
with
I'm going
blood.
to tear
Yeah.
your house down. I'm going to throw you down like a lamb and smash your skull in and make
Yep.
your gray beard run red with gore. Like,
Yep.
that's how she talks to the Heavenly Father, the creator of the universe, her father.
No
She
fear.
goes up and threatens him out of the gate. She doesn't even say hello. There's no niceties at all. She comes up and promptly threatens to smash his skull in. And how does he respond? Is he
He's like, I
insulted?
know.
Does he
He's like,
say,
I
how
know you're
dare you
angry.
speak like? Is he indignant? No, he says, oh, what do you want? I'll give you whatever you want. And he just gives it to her. He doesn't respond indignantly. He doesn't, how dare you treat your father like that? No, he's like, yeah, nobody as violent as you. Hey, Nat, I'll give you what you want.
Yeah.
And then he says, go talk to your mother, Asherah, and you'll get her permission. And so they bring her silver and gold and presents. And so they do that. And as they're walking up to visit Asherah, what does Asherah do?
She's like
She starts quaking in her boots. She's
shaking.
trembling with fear. She says,
What
what
are you here
are
for?
violent Anat and Baal doing here? Are they going to kill my lions? Are they going to kill me? Are they going to kill my sons? And then when she sees that they're bearing gifts, then she relaxes. She's like, okay. And she, Anat doesn't really threaten Asherah, I don't think.
No,
Does she?
I don't think so either. No, I don't think so.
So they ask for the gifts, and then they give her the gifts, and Asherah gets permission. So then they all go visit El together, or maybe El go visits first, or Asherah goes visits first. This is the funniest part. Asherah comes and she gives respect to El. She bows down. I mean, everyone's got to give each other respect. But El's like, hey, my wife is here. Hey, you want to get randy? And he's trying to put some
drink what
moves
you
on
want,
her.
have what you
Are
want.
you seeing Mr. Viral L over here? And she's like, yeah,
Yes.
not today. No, thanks.
No,
And
I'm
she's
not.
like,
It's business. It's business, pal. Sorry.
and she turns him down. She totally turns him down. And he gets all annoyed. He's like, why? What am I, just a slave girl to here make bricks for you? And she's like, no, I need something from you. And then he brightens up. But it's totally hilarious. This whole interchange is hilarious. He tries to seduce her. She totally plays him off, says no respectfully. He gets annoyed.
She placates him.
But she's like, hey, and he's all right at the end. And then, Anat comes back and threatens him again. Anat, every single time she sees El, she threatens to destroy. She does it in other stories too. She does it in other stories too, not even in the Baal cycle. Like, that is a repeating motif. And whenever she approaches El, she threatens to kill him. And then I think she does to other gods too.
Well, Mott, she kills utterly.
We'll get to Mott here in a sec.
Sorry, yeah.
And so that's why I think that they don't mention her in the Bible, because this is a character. Even to name her is to name someone that can go to Elohim and threaten to destroy him and actually have the power to do it, because she's got the power to devour the entire universe. He may have created the universe, but she's got the power and the destiny to someday consume it and destroy it all. Just like Kali, she is going to be the one who's going to eat the universe at the end of days and give birth to the next rebirth. But at the end of the days, the last girl standing is going to be Anat. And that's why they can't mention her. And why all the monotheistic traditions are all about eternal life and not a cycle of life. They're always like, you're going to go live forever in heaven.
Right.
There's
And
no
there's
cycle
a
of life.
huge difference with that.
They don't want a life, death, rebirth. That's a feminine thing. I
hadn't even really thought I mean, I understand the cycle of life, but I hadn't really thought that it really is a feminine aspect.
That's the key. That's
wow,
the key to the whole aspect. Is cycle of life, circular thinking versus linear eternal life thinking. And it impacts the entire
ladder
mindset
climbing
of the entire culture. Dominance hierarchies on one on top of the other, as opposed to cooperative modes of
interconnected
living.
Intersectionality.
It's just all this male-female thing.
Come on, Ed. Education.
Yeah,
I love it. I love it.
And so Anat represents this ultimate. She's more powerful than everyone. So then the last part with Anat is in the Baal cycle. Baal gets his temple. Gets a little too big for his britches after a while. And, they've been the other gods. He decides that he's more powerful than death. And so he's going to go defeat death and take over Hades as well, or whatever.
Bad move.
And so he goes and fights Mot. And the gods decide that Baal can't get away with that. And so El ultimately rules that Mot has to win, and Mot kills Baal, and Baal dies. And with that dies all the fertility of the land. And everything's going to hell, and everybody's sad, and everybody's mourning. And so Anat goes and buries Baal ritually and does all her mourning. And then some time goes by, and she decides that she's had enough. And so she goes and finds Mot, the god of death, and just grabs him by the collar and says, "Give me back my brother." And then she proceeds to cleave him in half with a sword, burn him with a fire, grind him up with a millstone, and feed him to the birds. And then with that, Baal is restored, and Baal comes back to life and is put back on his throne. So imagine.
I think it's important to think about how much she's an intricate part of that cycle. Like, she's the one who plants him, almost like he's a vegetation in which he can now come back. But she has to complete
an
that
agricultural ritual. The whole grinding him with a stone and feeding to the birds, like, that's an agricultural ritual. And then she defeats death and restores him to life, because she is the all-powerful one. She has more power than anybody. Nobody can challenge her. Not death, not the creator, no one.
Right.
And then Baal,
mighty Shapehash.
And then Baal, having her as his consort, makes Baal the most powerful. There's no male god that can challenge Baal if he's got to go fight through Anat too. Because Anat's got Baal's back, and so so that makes Baal untouchable. He's the most powerful dude. And he goes look who he's got as his wingman, his wing girl there. Wouldn't you like to have Anat as your wing girl?
Absolutely.
No one's...
especially if she can bring me back if I die. Hello. Resurrection, would you? Thank you.
So yeah, Anat is just this unbelievably powerful, beyond power character. And so I call her she who must not be named. They can't name her in the Old Testament, not even to insult her, not to defame her, not to cut her down. You can't even have her in the story. She cannot exist, because to name something is to make it exist. That's to give it power. That's to give it presence. Naming things in religion is very important. Like in Egyptian, once you give something a name, that means something. And in the Bible and biblical traditions too, giving something a name has all sorts of theological, symbolic implications. So to not name her when we know that she was there, we know for damn sure that this is who Jezebel was praying to go smash Elijah after, keep killing all the prophets on Mount Carmel. She would be praying to Anat to bring him in his head,
Right. Oh, I love the thought. I hadn't thought about that, but obviously that's who she would sequester for help in that kind of battle.
In that kind of situation. Exactly. When you want blood spilled, you're praying to Anat, man. And so, yeah, she who must not be named. She is so powerful. And then you take these three goddesses together, Asherah, Astarte, and Anat, and the most beautiful warrior maiden, the mother of the universe, and the death goddess. I mean, these are just beyond. I mean, they're just like, it's so outrageous. So I really want to like tell this story better. I want to write another book, and I want to do graphic novels to just
Yeah, I
like
definitely think
bring
you
the stories
should.
out.
You're good at it. You have a really good grasp of what was happening. I just since you mentioned Jezebel, I kind of wanted to quickly just because
A real
I don't know.
historical character, mind you, an actual
Right.
person of history.
Yes. We know that she existed. They found her seal, so we know that she's conducted business. She's the amulet,
We
which is
absolutely
really
know where her
pretty
husband
cool.
and her father were
Right. And they were, I mean,
important
Ahab
characters.
was
Like they were like
yeah,
significant.
and a good king, honestly, as far as we
Ahab
can
was like a
tell.
major
Seemed like they
military leader in
flourished.
like the Bronze
Right.
Age, like or Iron
But
Age. They're Iron Age.
something I wanted to make mention, I did just do a video about Jezebel, but she too, and I don't know, you probably noticed, when they had their children, they named all of their children with theophoric Yahwistic names.
That was interesting.
And
You were pointing that out, and I thought that was an interesting. I never would have guessed that.
right, and it just kind of doesn't make sense to me to paint her as somebody who would be against the Yahwist when, like we said, it was likely possibly her that named them, to name them after the Yahwist, and then to say that she
Well, I mean,
hated them.
Ahab may have named them. I think Ahab was on the fence.
And there's always that possibility too. But I personally don't see her being so rigid against, because she's a polytheist. The only reason she would
Right.
maybe have
She may not
pushback
have
is
liked
because they're coming after her.
It's true. We don't know, like, because at this time period, when Yahweh is fighting with Baal, he's taking on the goddesses as his consorts. They're not knocking the goddesses out just yet. That doesn't come till later.
Yeah.
Because that was the last stage. The first stage is knock off Baal, and they have their hands full fighting with Baal for centuries. And so when you see in the text, like, they smash the temples to Baal and stuff multiple times. They aside from chopping down the Asherah poles, the Kadesha pretty much remained. They chase out the Kadesh, the male ones, a couple times. But they're never really able to knock out the goddesses, not up to the very end. They're worshiping the Queen of Heaven right up until the destruction by the Babylonians, because Jeremiah blames the women. He says, look, if you had never stopped worshiping the Queen of Heaven, and like, we've been doing it, everything was fine when we were worshiping the Queen of Heaven. How dare you? So it's clear
and then
that
it was not too long after that things did go bad. So as far as I'm concerned, it was the removing of the divine feminine that caused a lot of issues. I mean, that's just my simplistic way of wrapping that part up.
I think there's something to be said for the gap that exists.
And also too, I just wanted to mention, since you were saying that, the Bible kind of makes it look like they wiped it out pretty immediately, even though there doth protest too much. But the Elephantine papyri that has Anat Yahu, and that's I think it's from the 5th century. So obviously there are groups of, Yah or whatever worshipers who see him with Anat as a consort. And
there's so much political upheaval in that time period. Like, the Assyrians come through, wipe out a lot of people, and then the Persians come through, and then the Greeks come through. And so,
yes,
I think that, these Baal traditions, which are the Phoenician religion, the Greeks and the Romans both hated the Phoenicians. And so, the Greeks and the Romans both defeated and wiped out the Baal religions. And then the Jews, they wipe out the Baal stuff within their own community, but there was still Baal worship elsewhere. And so, I don't know, like, to what extent, like, there was Yahweh worship outside the rabbis. Once the rabbis come in, how long does it take them to consolidate control around their message? I don't know. As opposed to the earlier pagan, I don't know. There was so much upheaval, it's hard to say. But
there was, and it's all going to cause changes, new ideas. I've heard people say, and it was something I never really thought, there's no borders, there's no barriers. Like, this stuff there's travel, there's trade, there's war, there's all these things that are bringing these ideas together. A lot more fluid than I ever realized, and all the synchronicity between these different gods, or amalgamation.
When you see a pattern that flows really consistently over many cultures and for a long period of time, those are the ones you want to pay attention to, because you recognize that, like, every community is going to do things a little bit differently. and they're going to tell the stories differently. It's like comic books. How many times have you seen the birth of Superman or like Batman's origin stories
Good
retold,
point.
Spider-Man's origin stories? As long as they hit certain beats, then it qualifies as, Spider-Man. He's got to be bit by a radioactive spider. He's got to be a teenage kid. There's got to be certain things to make it Peter Parker, but otherwise you can change all the other details and you can have fun with it. And that's the way this mythology is. And so the cultures will change them all, will change details, but the details that remain the same, those are the ones that really matter. And when you see the same motif repeating over like a triple goddess, a mother, maiden, and death triple goddess repeating over and over and over, like that's when that's something you got to pay attention to. It's also the daughters of Allah in the Quran. The satanic verses. The three daughters of Allah
Manat.
is also another triple goddess.
I love that because I've just learned about that. It might even been from something that you were on that I learned that, because I had no idea that they even possibly had the triple god. I mean, of course they did, but I didn't know that there was a possibility.
Well, because the Arabs were pagans until Muhammad came along, and he was born into a pagan family, and so they had pagan matriarchal tribes, and living out in the desert, and he brings in this response to Christianity, and writes the Quran.
I did see a question. So guys, we are at the hour mark. If you have any more, if you have any questions, but JW No More says, so what group of people wrote these myths? Is it Bronze Age writing? And I'm guessing you're talking about the stuff from.
So the writing is, so in the Bronze Age, they use cuneiform writing, and that cuneiform basically goes away. That was the international writing that all the various courts would write to each other, write letters. It was all in cuneiform, and that goes away with the Bronze Age collapse. And then you've got 3 or 4, even 500 years where there's like no writing at all, and then you get the phonetic alphabets, and that was invented by the Phoenicians, and then both the Hebrews and the Greeks copy it to create the Hebrew language, the Hebrew written language, and the Greek written language. Now there was vestiges of it earlier, and like there was iterations of it earlier, but they don't come into like common usage until like the 9th century BC, like the 800s BC. And that's when we start to see coins with writing on it, and like steles with writing on it. Like the Egyptian stele from 1208, that's Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now the Egyptians kept writing some hieroglyphics, but that was only for like temples and stuff. They didn't use that for like writing letters to one another. They didn't write it in hieroglyphics. So the Egyptians still had something, because there's still some different writings from Egypt on monuments that are from that time period. But the first one that's in Hebrew language is 850 BC. It's the Moabite stele, and it's talking about a battle that's in the Bible. It's about a battle that where the king sacrifices his son on the battlements, and it turns the tide against the Israelites. And the Israelites, it apparently worked. Like it worked.
They did. They skedaddled.
The Moabite king did it. And then the Moabites win the battle, and they erected this victory stele that the archaeologists have found, and that dates to 850 BC. And that mentions Yahweh. And that mentions that they were fighting this war against the Israelites with their God Yahweh. And that's the first mention of Yahweh in archaeology. And that's, but
the
that's
name that we know as.
That Yahweh shows up like in writing. In the context of biblical stuff. Like the earlier one just says Israel. This says Yahweh. But that's also when the writing is just beginning. And so it's from that moment going forward, like 850 going forward, then we have like written word in both Greek and in Hebrew. And that's when you start seeing all this stuff. And from that period forward, we have really good history. Like we know exactly who was the king everywhere, because we've got their coins. We've got so many records, Assyrian records, Babylonian records, Israelite records. Like there's all this record keeping from like, and it just gets better and better. And so from 850 BC going forward, we can really lock down all of the, we can really say with certainty, like what the map out the Bible stories against the historical story. And so in 850, that's after Israel and Judah have already split into 2 separate countries. So this is why we don't have perfect proof of the United Kingdom of Israel under King Solomon.
Yeah.
There's no evidence of that. It doesn't say it didn't happen, but when the writing kicks in is a little bit after that. And by that time, Israel and Judah are already separate countries. And so King Ahab, for instance, is around this time period. Queen Jezebel is right around this 850-ish, 820, something like that. Jezebel was on the throne for quite a while, like decades. And Ahab and his father was Omri. So they had the house. It was called the House of Omri. The northern kingdom of Israel was called the House of Omri. And they were both major military leaders and both show up in like the record keeping of that time period. Ahab in particular was like a major, they fought a big ass battle. And Ahab was like a big, like victorious hero character. Like he's an important guy, Jezebel's husband. And then he gets killed in battle. And then Jezebel becomes queen mother and her son is on the throne. And at this point, he is an ally of the king in Jerusalem. And they both go to war together, fighting side by side in
Is that
Syria.
Jehoram?
Jehoram is one of them, yeah. And they both get killed in the same battle. And this is a story where Jehu is the guy who kills Jezebel.
I hate Jehu. I want to throw
in the
him
Bible.
off the
He
fucking
takes
balcony.
claim for killing both of them, right? In the Bible, he takes credit for killing both those kings. Well, in the Aramean records, the Syrian Aramites, I think they're called.
Okay.
Their king takes credit for killing both those guys. There's an archaeological record of the same battle, and he takes credit for killing both the kings. So
I'm going to be looking into that one. And Jehu's such a dick because he's doing everything that Jezebel's doing, but it's okay that he's doing it because he's a dude.
Right. And
he's
Jehu,
worshiping the false idols.
Because we have records from Assyria of him laying prostrate to the Assyrian king and being a vassal of the Assyrian king.
I love that
part. So we know
part.
Jehu's a real character too. And so he follows Yahweh, and he's one of the guys who destroys a temple of Baal, but they don't destroy Asherah poles, and they don't take down the golden bulls. There's 2 golden bulls, one in the north in Dan and one in the south in Bethel. And these are the same golden calves that Moses was upset about, because these golden calves, they represent El, and they represent these old pagan ways. This is the symbol of the old paganism that Yahweh doesn't like. And Yahweh wants to get rid of the golden calf because it's the political symbol, the cultural, religious symbol of the old pagan ways and of El and Baal. And so, but Jehu, they say quite explicitly in the scripture, he destroyed the temple of Baal, which and is totally grotesque with the amount of people he murders. He murders the entire houses in both.
And how he did it, tricking
quite
them
gruesomely.
and
And then, he tricks everybody. He brings everybody to the temple of Baal and says, everybody, we're going to have a big celebration to Baal, make a big sacrifice. And when everybody comes in, they lock the doors from the outside and burn the place down and slaughter everybody. And it's this mass murder. And he's a really, really horrible figure. And apparently a real guy, and a real guy. So I take it at face value. I think that story is totally true. I think he totally murdered all these people in the temple.
I believe
he's a really horrible person. And then he kills both royal families. There was some visitors coming or something, and from the south, and he kills all them. Kills the royal family in the north, and then he famously has Jezebel assassinated, and she is thrown out the window, defenestered, right? And that's like very symbolic to throw her down from like the tower window. Like, so whether that happened or not, or is just symbolic, either way, he had her murdered.
Right. And then
her daughter, her daughter is Athaliah, who's a minor character unless you've studied this stuff, but she becomes queen mother in Jerusalem, in Judah, because of their political alliance. And she apparently kills off all of her competitors, and she takes the throne for herself. And Athaliah becomes the only woman that I'm aware of that in all the whole biblical story that rules Jerusalem as a solo queen.
That's dope.
And for
regardless if it was good or bad, it's dope. I'm sorry.
All right. So for 6 years, she rules Jerusalem, and then she gets murdered in an assassination. So it's a pretty blood and guts. It's some pretty blood and guts politics in those days, man. These folks don't mess around.
It was basically, in my opinion, it was all their way to get rid of the matriarchs. It was the patriarchy taking over.
Well, I mean, they're chipping away.
Right.
Kidnapping women. Like, you're allowed to kidnap women and bring them back. Modern day ISIS terrorists do this. Like, it's part of scripture, and you're allowed to. In Deuteronomic law, it says And if you're in a war and you see some young girl you like, you can bring her back. I mean, that's just licensed to kidnap women, which is like something they did. You kidnap the girls from the
God told
matriarchal
Moses to
tribe
do it.
and bring them back to the patriarchal family under patriarchal terms. And so they would have been doing this routinely for centuries. And it would have just been something that women had to like face as a day-to-day threat, that like you might be out on the open road somewhere and some marauding bandit might just kidnap you and bring you back to his patriarchal family and force you to be his wife. And that was totally legal. It's totally in the laws of Deuteronomy that you're allowed to do that. Because that's how you pick off these matriarchal tribes. And it would have taken centuries. But it's like cutting down the old growth forests, a little bit of time, a little bit of time, a little bit of time. And eventually you knock it all down. And I think what we're seeing in the Iron Age in the first millennium BC is like that final surge where like the patriarchy just completes the work that had been going on since the beginning of the Bronze Age. And it just becomes full tilt patriarchy with like no looking back. And it's why it's so important that they eliminate these goddesses from from the culture, because you don't want your daughters even having these characters, even having these stories. They can't have these role models. All the stories of Ishtar disrespecting your father and being sexually promiscuous are just like unacceptable stories. Like you can't even allow those fables to even exist at all. And so you have to eliminate the entire religions, tear down the statues, tear down the iconography, erase the murals from the walls. Otherwise your daughters be getting the wrong ideas. And so, and the same thing with, this is a new theory I've got about the biblical date of creation is 4000 BC, right? It's kind of an odd date to choose. Now we talk about a 6,000 year Earth, young Earth, but it's 4000 BC. Like that's the date they picked. So like, why did they pick that date? William Lane Craig, the modern day apologist, the really famous Christian apologist. He was talking about this. Now, William Lane Craig is sophisticated enough to like treat these stories as allegory and not like get hung up on like a young Earth hard date, like the way some fundamentalists will. And so he talks about, he says, why would they pick that date? Because like, even by their standards, they weren't that ignorant. They knew the Earth was way older than that. Like the towns that they were living in were way older than that. Jericho had already been inhabited for many, many thousands of years. Jericho, the city of Jericho, where they knocked down the walls, that's a Neolithic settlement. That's one of the original settlements for the Neolithic Revolution. People have been living there for 7,000 years already before the arrival of the Israelites, before Joshua knocking down the walls, whatever you want to say about that story.
Yeah, the walls are probably already...
They were already knocked down centuries earlier from a previous earthquake. And they just take credit. They're like, see those walls knocked down? Those are our guys. We knocked those walls down. But yeah, so the towns of Mesopotamia were way older than 4000 BC, and they knew this. So what are they saying with that date? Well, I think it corresponds with the emphasis on patriarchal generations in the Bible. They're always going on and on, listing their patriarchs back in time, all the way back to Adam. So-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. And anyone who's read the Bible has to endure these long-winded pages
lineages,
so-and-so well, why are they doing that? What's the point of like putting all this time and effort and paper into listing these lineages? Well, because they're trying to establish patriarchy, and they're establishing them back as far back as they can reckon, which is 4000 BC, which just so happens to be the beginning of the Bronze Age, the invention of swords and weapons, the rise of kingship, the rise of slavery. All that stuff happens with the technology revolution that introduces weapons.
Interesting.
That introduces farming. Like they change with the Bronze Age, you go from planting to farming. Planting being kind of woman's work near the home, low intensity. Farming, now you've got plows and shovels. Now you can start to dig up the earth, but you need like oxen and beasts of burden. And it becomes man's work, farther away from home on bigger fields. So now the men start to assert themselves with this technology revolution, and that starts slowly, and it begins around 4000 BC, ish. And it just so happens that's as far back as they can list their patriarchal generations. And then they're just sort of saying there is no other history. We haven't been around for 10,000 years. We haven't been around for 100,000 years. No, history begins with the rise of the
Mhm.
patriarchy. And the only history you ever have to know about are our patriarchal generations. We don't even want you to know about any matriarchal generations. Forget about the fact
Yeah.
that that was actually the majority of human history was matriarchal. We don't want you to know about any of it. We're not going to teach you about any of it. It's not in our books anymore. It's not going to be what we teach our children. It's not going to be what we teach our daughters. We're only going to teach them that there's this very young earth and that Abraham is impossibly far back in time, because Abraham's 2000 BC by biblical reckoning. So he's halfway to creation. Like Abraham is like,
Right, never thought about it like that, but like,
yeah,
sheesh.
so they're totally
Yeah.
skewing this, the whole sense of how
It
of
does, yeah,
history
chronologically, it
to
doesn't really make
impose
sense.
this very specific worldview that is very intentional about cutting off the women from their own agency and identity and power and keeping the women locked down, and half of the human culture intentionally subverted under the man's thumb, which was just not the way it had been for most of human history. We've got 2 million years we've been wandering around, 1 million years since we started using fire and spears, 60,000 years since we've been doing cave paintings and Venus figurines and doing ritual burials, which is presumably when we start talking and telling stories and really start to have a higher consciousness. 60,000 years of history. Then I think there's a mass extinction event at 12,800 years ago. That's the flood. I think the flood story is actually symbolic of an actual event that is a mass extinction event that kills off all the woolly mammoths and saber-tooth tigers and all the animals that we've been living aside are totally demoed in one fell swoop, and humans too. And it's probably this meteor strike in the Younger Dryas that wipes out everybody and everything and is a complete calamity, and that humans barely survive, and the sea levels rise dramatically, wiping out all the coastal civilizations. And that 90% of humanity is killed in one fell swoop, and they survive, a Mad Max hellscape for centuries before the weather finally settles down. And it's the survivors of this trauma that start planting, that begin the Neolithic Revolution when the weather finally settles down and the climate improves. These traumatized, terrified people come out of their caves, and they've learned to sprout seeds and what have you, because for survival probably, and they learn to start planting. And then the weather improves. We get into the Holocene climactic period 10,000 years ago that we live in now, and we get the Neolithic Revolution. That's like 12,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. The first half of that is all Neolithic settlements with no evidence of warfare, not, big mass. I mean, there's fighting, but no like organized armies. There's no evidence of weapons or slaughterhouses or villages being burned. There's no evidence of any of that stuff. There's no evidence of kings. There's no evidence of slavery. There's no evidence of one single leader being elevated above everybody else. Maybe like a shaman or somebody, but like not like pharaohs buried with wealth or anything. All that stuff happens with this technology revolution that we call the Bronze Age, the invention of bronze that brings swords and plows. And then violent men started asserting themselves over peaceful people. And because if one group of people with swords and armor can slaughter an entire, large number of people and impose their will by force. And then you get the rise of kingship. And once you start having warfare, then you need to defend yourself. So like, then it's conquer or be conquered. Now it's kill or be killed. Now you gotta fight, and you need to have generals. You need to have kings who can, you need to have armies, because otherwise you're just going to be enslaved. And so like now it's just everyone's got to have an army. And once you get into that time period, that's what we call civilization. And that's when we get into, modern urban civilization. 3500 BC is Uruk is the first city in Mesopotamia that becomes what we call a modern urban city. And that's just 500 years after the creation. And these are led by kings. They've got permanent armies. They're always fighting. They've got their holy women and stuff, but like you can see, and then, writing gets invented right after that. And so you get from the Sumerian writing into the Babylonian writing and then into the Bible, you see over time in these succession of law codes, the women losing their rights. You see the holy women being curtailed, a little bit of time, chisel by chisel by chisel, but over the centuries. And when you take the oldest laws of Sumer to the laws of Hammurabi, which are 1800 BC in Babylon, and then to the Deuteronomic Code, which is like 600 BC, you see how the Kadesha, the holy women, Kadesha means holy. So these holy women are literally the holy ones and the virgins. That's what they called them as a title of respect because they were unmarried.
And there's a link to the I'm guessing Kudshu or Kadesh or whatever you want to call her from Egypt. I think that's
I
there's
was
an
mentioned before they're
etymological.
all secretized. And so, yeah, that goddess Kadesh is just another name for Asherah, as far as I know. And that's just a
Yeah,
depiction of Asherah. And they're just using the same, just that same name. She's the holy one. Kadesh means holy.
right.
It gets translated in the Bible as, in English text, as temple prostitutes. The word means holy ones. The name literally means holy one.
Yeah.
And they're called temple harlots or temple prostitutes. And then there is a separate word for a normal prostitute. A zona is a conventional like brothel prostitute who's not sacred. So it's two separate words, zona and kadesha. Clearly two different words. In the King James Bible, they're all just harlots. King James Bible doesn't even call them temple harlots. They're all just harlots.
King James.
And then the Kadesh are their male transgender counterparts, also holy ones. So, yeah, because that name, and there's towns called Kadesh too. And so those are like holy cities. Miriam, Moses' sister, is buried in the city of Kadesh, which I think she's a Kadesh. I think, the story where
definitely
Miriam gets in an argument with Moses and she gets punished and kicked out. And
but Aaron
she was
doesn't.
the leader of the women. She gets in a fight with Moses about his wife, something about his wife. We don't really know what the fight is about. It's a very mysterious, ambiguous passage. The text was clearly trimmed. There's something has clearly been left out of that story. And then she gets punished by God. She's a prophetess. She's, God only speaks to three people in that part of the story. Moses, his brother Aaron, and their sister Miriam. The three of them are the prophets and the prophetess. Both Aaron screws up multiple times. He never gets punished. He brings out the golden bull. He doesn't get punished for it.
Nope.
And then he's in this argument with Miriam. They're both arguing with Moses about, what are you doing with your wife? This, they don't say what it is that they're arguing about, or even which wife it is. But only Miriam gets punished, and Miriam gets punished with leprosy and sent out. And Moses begs God not to kill her. And so God says, fine, I won't kill her. But just gives her leprosy and sends her out of the tribe until she's healed. And then she disappears from the story. And the only time she's mentioned again is her death. And when she's buried, and Miriam died there, and she was buried in the city of Kadesh, which I think is an obvious reference to, she's presumably a Kadesha. If she's the leader of the women,
I think so.
She leads the women in music. She doesn't have a husband. Miriam, as far as I know, is unmarried, doesn't have children. So I think she's a holy woman. But this is the first fight, I argue, that this is the first fight in the 700-year Reformation, the 700-year culture war between the followers of Yahweh and the priests and the priestesses. And they fight about it for centuries after that. And this is just the very first throwdown. And Miriam was the first one to be chopped. But, but they don't go away. They don't go away.
Yeah, and even again with folk religion, I mean, we obviously have the Bible's take on it, but we don't know exactly when, how all these images of Asherah or the other goddesses, whatever, were finally squashed out. But obviously, the Bible is going to.
Well, we do know one thing. All right, we can say a couple of things from archaeology. Here's a couple of really fascinating stuff from archaeology. One is the household goddesses of Asherah. Let's mention that first. So the figurines, the Asherah figurines, you've seen this, the pillar-based figurines.
Yep.
So these are reminiscent of the Venus figurines that people had been making back in the Ice Age. For tens of thousands of years, people have been making little figurines of goddesses, right? And so they find these are really common archaeological find in Israel. And they're in the households. They call them household gods, and they reference household gods in stories too. Like, it's not uncommon. There's like so and so snatched the household god from such and such. Like, that's like something that happens because they're literally talking about a bunch of statues on a little private altar that people have in their homes, right? And so you might steal them for some reason, it kind of things happen. And so they found loads and loads of these, thousands and thousands of them, really, really common archaeological find, right up until the time period of Josiah's Reformation. And when Josiah says, there's the two big reformers, King Hezekiah, who's a historical person, who's a really definitive known historical person who lived in the 700s BC, and he has one set of reforms. And then about a century later is King Josiah, who's a bigger character in the Bible in terms of or has bigger reforms, but he doesn't really show up in the other countries' historical records. But he gets killed by the Egyptians in a battle we know took place. According to the biblical text, he gets his ass killed by the Egyptians by being a dumbass, and going into a battle that he didn't need to fight. Anyway, but Josiah is the major reformer. He's the one who overturns the altars. It's very clear. They turned down the altars. They smashed, and they talk about smashing the household gods. They dug up the Tophet and desecrated. The Tophet is where was the cemetery for the ritual burials of the babies. So they desecrated the Tophet. So they dug it up, which is why they didn't find one now, because they literally dug it up in the Bible story. It says we dug it up and got rid of it.
Says it does.
So that's why they haven't been able to find one, but they found them in other Phoenician towns. But anyway, the household gods, they found these right up until the moment when in the archaeological record where these reforms happened. And then they stopped making them. And there's no more of these household Asherah figurines anymore. They stopped me. It's not, all right, to be fair, Josiah is the last king. It's not long after that the Babylonians come and wipe them all out anyway. So, but basically, and the archaeology is not that precise. You can't date it to a 20-year time period.
Yeah.
So anyway, the point is they find these figurines are really common up until these reforms and up until Jerusalem gets destroyed. And then they really stop being there. They stop finding them. And then secondly, the Temple of Tel Arad. Tel Arad's a very famous archaeological site. And it's the one place where they found a temple that dates from the time period of King Solomon's temple, but it's outside of Jerusalem. And in this altar, in this temple, and you can see it in the Israel Museum, there in the Holy of Holies is a pair of standing stones for a pair of gods, for Yahweh and Asherah. Now, they kind of whitewash it in the museum, but if you read the archaeological scholarship, it's clearly that there's two standing stones there and a pair of incense altars. And one of the stones is taller than the other. One of the altars is taller than the other. So the taller one is for the male god, it's for Yahweh and his Asherah. Granted, I still think it's his mother, not his wife. I think because the Asherah pole stood next to the altar of Baal too, because she's choosing who's to become king of the gods. I don't think it's his wife. I think it's his mother. That's my personal thesis. Still think it's his mother.
Hey, I'm down for whatever. She's there.
Way,
that's all I know. She's there.
She is right there next to the king of the gods. And
cannabis was found on one of the.
Right.
You're getting there. Okay, sorry.
A few details. They scrape the incense altars. They scrape the residue to figure out. Now they had dug up these altars a long time ago, but scraping the residue, that's brand new work from published 2020 or in the 2020s. It's brand new.
This is new stuff.
And on the Yahweh altar was frankincense, just like we see in the Bible. And on the Asherah altar was cannabis. It was hashish. They were burning hashish to the mother goddess.
Getting lit.
This goes back to why did they get rid of cannabis? Because it's sacred to the mother traditions. It's totally sacred.
And that's what I love about this book is how you're tying in some of the sacred stuff that connects, the females to the goddess.
It started out as a book about cannabis, and then I rewrote it as a book about Asherah, and I stitched the two texts together.
But I love that because I feel like it's it's very authentic. It's you were finding your way as you were writing the book. And I hope more people kind of start working their way through this stuff like that.
So the modern archaeology have now utterly confirmed. But the second important detail that they were burning weed in the temple. But the second important detail is that when they found this altar, it wasn't smashed or anything. It had been carefully laid over. They had turned them over and had buried the whole thing with sand intentionally. This is exactly what they describe in Josiah's reforms, that they overturned. It's exactly what they described, that they overturned the temples and did all this stuff. They deliberately buried it with sand. This wasn't buried by the sands of time. And it wasn't destroyed in a war. These were deliberately overturned in the reformations that they're describing in the Old Testament. And so the amount of archaeology that lines up exactly with the Bible stories, but then tells us that they were pagans, is just so fascinating. It's so fascinating. And the story becomes so interesting when it's not just this old, like, dry looking for evidence of Jesus in the Old Testament who's not even there. Hey, Christians, the Old Testament is not about Jesus. Let me tell you, it's not
How
about
dare you?
Jesus. The Old Testament's about this
Yeah, I
pagan
agree.
reformation. It's about a pagan reformation that ends up as monotheism, but they're not monotheists in the first temple at all.
I'll
And they,
fight people about that word. I think it's a misnomer. I think they're trying to make monotheism a thing, but it doesn't exist, not even to their definition. If Satan's a
well, the
god,
Christian
sorry.
definitions, yeah. I mean, well, that's, I
Yeah.
mean, Jesus and the Trinity is this monotheism or not. I mean, that's the classic Islamic critique of Christianity, which is a totally legitimate critique, mind you. It's like,
Agreed.
it's really not monotheism.
Doesn't work. Sorry. But
Christian theology doesn't make
monolatry,
sense.
I can totally understand the monolatry and wanting to just worship the Yahweh or just the one God, but
Well, I
pretending
really
the
think
others
it's a
don't exist is
I think it's a culture war first. I think it's a culture war first, and it's the theology
right, which
comes
is
later.
why
They write the
Mhm.
stories later to justify these on the ground culture war fights that they were having. This is much more like brass knuckles, bloody knuckles politics. Like, this is on the street, people getting in disputes about very real stuff, like very real stuff. Like, I can't emphasize enough. I think the child sacrifice, they were really doing it, and that it's been mistranslated. Another bit of modern scholarship. They're traditionally translated as sacrifices to the god Moloch, Moloch. That's how it's translated in English.
Yeah.
So everybody knows the god Moloch. I don't think Moloch's a real god, or maybe he is at someplace else, but the modern scholarship thinks that that's a mistranslation, and that it's because the Hebrew has no
Kind of
vowel.
sacrifice.
The original Hebrew has only has consonants in it. So you've got to put the vowels back in. And so it's really easy to get the translations wrong when you put the wrong vowels in. And so they think that it's now it's supposed to be. So the letters are MLK. So, but people said it was a god Moloch, but now they think it's just it's a word mulk, MULK, and that it's just a name for a type of sacrifice. And this is a sacrifice that the Phoenicians did. Now, there's a lot of different contexts for human sacrifice. Sometimes you're sacrificing the firstborn, either of your cattle or
As
even
you
your
do.
son, which I think that they did that too, and that's something separate. Another kind of sacrifice is in times of calamity or distress, like we're talking about the Moabites, that were where you'll sacrifice the royalty, where the royalty will sacrifice their heir to the throne, and the prince or princess may even go willingly. Because it's a famine, like everybody's dying, or your city's being laid to siege and there's no food left and everyone's terrified and everyone's going to die. And it's actually seen as something noble and valorous for the prince to sacrifice themselves in hopes of appeasing the gods. And that's exactly what they do in that battle of Moab. And it works. Like, the prince is sacrificed, and then the tides of the battle change and the Israelites retreat and the city survives the day. And but that's something you only do under distress. Like, you do as a last resort, right? So that's kind of understandable. I can actually kind of appreciate the emotion behind that. But this Molk sacrifice,
I understand.
Well, you can it's
no, I get it.
Everybody's dying. Like,
you're so right. You're so stressed to a point.
Surrounded by death.
Desperate.
It's a completely desperate moment, right? Like, it's not pleasant, right? But it's logical. But the Molk sacrifice, this is something else altogether. And this is something the Phoenicians did, and the Greeks and Romans wrote about it as well. And they found a massive tophet in Carthage, because that's another in North Africa is there, and the Carthaginians fought against the Romans. That's where Hannibal is all from Carthage. The Carthaginian Wars. They're Phoenicians as well. And so they also have these same practices with Baal. And the Greeks and Romans wrote about it, and they hated it. And they talk about it, how there was this bizarre ritual where they were really just asking favor of the gods. It wasn't something you did in distress. It wasn't you weren't doing it because it was your firstborn and you were obligated to do it because it's your firstborn. This was something that they would voluntarily do it. Like, please let me win the lottery, or please let me win this house, or whatever. Please let this, this overseas voyage go well. and I will sacrifice one of my babies for you. And they would throw the babies in the fire. And there was a whole ritual to it. They would stoke up this really hot fire and throw the baby in there. And the baby would like have this, like the fire would cause like this like
This
smile.
weird,
As they
yeah.
called it, there was a term for it. They called it a sardonic grin. It would be the last
Ooh.
expression of these babies. And they would beat tambourines and drums, and no one was allowed to cry. And if you cried or anyone shed a tear, then it would invalidate the ritual, and you couldn't cry.
Ooh.
And so you have to keep quiet. And they'd bang drums and stuff. And then when you went home,
come
you could
on
cry.
now.
Sheesh. And so this tradition went on for centuries. The Tophet in Carthage was used for like 600 years through good times and bad. It wasn't something they just did when it was distressed. They did it during normal times, and they did it voluntarily, as far as we can tell. And so it's a really nasty tradition. And the Greeks and Romans wrote about it, and they thought the Phoenicians were horrible people. Now, granted, they were enemies and they were rivals, so they didn't really like the Phoenicians that much anyway. But the Phoenicians have this older tradition. They have matriarchal traditions. They've got, and it's also important to recognize these gods, they were sacrificed to El. The Greeks and Romans describe them as being sacrifices to Kronos. And in the Bible, they describe them as sacrifices to Baal. Never are they sacrifices to Mother Goddess. I want to make this clear, because sometimes you'll see in Christian literature that they're making these sacrifices to the goddesses. They're not making these sacrifices to the goddesses. These sacrifices are clearly to either El or to Baal. And it's common to the Baal religion. It's the societies that have Baal as their king of the gods. This is I'd be love to talk to other scholars about this, but this is, as far as I can tell, this specific Mulk tradition. Now, there's other types of human sacrifice in different contexts, but the specific Mulk tradition is specific to the Phoenicians, and it's specific to Baal. And the Greeks and Romans and all in Hebrews were all contemporarily writing about it, and they all thought it was grotesque. They all thought it was a really horrible, hideous tradition.
Francesca Stavrokopoulou wrote a book about it, like a real like secular kind of thing. It was difficult for me to understand.
I'm familiar with her work.
But,
I didn't see one about the sacrifice. I didn't see her work on sacrifices.
I think it's really just trying to explain what the MLK, what it is. I found it somewhere. I didn't buy it.
You know which book it was? The only book I have of hers is her most recent one.
I can get that to you. I know I have it in my notes somewhere. But I read
another. There was another scholar whose work I read, and they were like pretty definitive that this MLK is this other thing.
Yeah, she agrees, and I agree with you.
Yeah, and it's its own distinct tradition, and it's a Phoenician tradition, a Canaanite tradition. Now, some people
what I wonder. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was point out that some people are like, well, they never found a Tophet in Israel. I'm like, well, in the Bible it says they dug it up. So that was my only last point.
Maybe that's the reason. I don't even remember what I was going to say, so it doesn't really matter.
So it's we've been on. I don't know how long we're on. I'd love to talk some more with you, and there's more stories we can go into detail.
Yeah, I'd love to have you back.
Matriarchal families.
I didn't get to anything I wrote down. I literally have all these different things I wanted to talk to you about.
A great conversation. I really would enjoy with you.
Yeah, well, I wanted to talk about the divine councils. There's so much stuff. So yeah, I'd love to have you back, and especially kind of hear more of your ideas that you're thinking of for your next book, because you've got a lot of stuff put together that I myself have found just by.
Well, what I'm going to be doing is
doing the
if
research.
I can get my SHIT together, I will be banging out a manuscript that's like an outline form that I can share. And I want to share it with as many people as I can to get it peer reviewed and have like real scholars looking at it, so that it's because my first book, this book is not academic. This book, I'll tell you, I'm very proud of this book, but it does not pass academic muster. This is not peer reviewed science. I mean, I stand by the assertions I make. There's some corrections I would make on minor stuff, but on the big themes, I totally stand by all of it 100%. But I want to write a book.
Is theory anyway.
I want to make
the Bible itself.
Down. It's an art that really tracks the archaeology and tracks these marital, where you see the family, where you see the marriages. That's where you can see the matriarchs. when you can see the man goes and lives with a woman's family, and Samson going marrying with the Philistines. This is a perfect example. That's one of like, there's a half a dozen examples. And then at the very end, when Ezra, back to the second temple after the Babylonian exile, Ezra brings back, he's the scribe, he's the guy who presumably put the Torah together, brings it back to Jerusalem in 458 BC, is one of the dates that they give. 5th century, 458. He's very upset when he finds that the men have continued to be marrying the Canaanite women. And he says, you must divorce all these Canaanite women. And he makes a big deal of that. He tears his shirt and he throws, they fall on the ground. And he's very upset. You know, it's a very dramatic moment. And so they do it. Like all the women that are going to stick around, all the men that are sticking around, they're forced to, are forced to get divorced. Well, why? What are they so upset about? Because these women are still have these damn matriarchal families and these ritual prostitution, and they're not monogamous, and yada, yada, yada. All that stuff was still going on. It gets wiped out soon enough with the Greeks and everybody else. But like, but yeah,
and that's
like
something we really want to get into too, just because I didn't realize how contemporary all these other cultures were, and how they're intertwining and they're building off of each other. There's a lot more happening in this.
Eve and Pandora are basically the same character. The first woman who is the source of all evil. They are totally contemporary. They are like written at the same time period.
Yeah, we didn't even get into the Eve, the Garden of Eden story, and I think that's a really big like.
All right, so that'll be the topic of next time. We'll start with Garden of Eden.
Let's do it. I would love to, because I'm really smitten. I read Arthur George. I forget what the book is.
I got it's a massive section of my book. It's a really important part.
Oh, do you? Okay, well, I can't wait to get to it, because I want to see exactly what you say too. If we're like,
basically, Eve represents Asherah and the Kadesha and the traditions. The tree of knowledge is it's a sacred plant. I think it's cannabis. I argue that it's cannabis, and that it's and the serpent. All this stuff are symbols of the pagan goddess traditions. The serpent is totally a goddess symbol. The tree of knowledge as sacred entheogenic plants is totally goddess stuff. The midwifery, the weaving, it's all in there. And so Eve represents these goddesses being put down, kicked out, told, you will now be monogamous. You will be subservient. This is the new order of things. Ladies, holy women, you're out of business.
And it's going to be painful, and you're going to get pain with it. Enjoy it. Enjoy the curse. Thanks. Exactly. Appreciate that.
Because in the goddess traditions, painful childbirth, painless, pain-free childbirth is part of their traditions, because they're midwives and potion makers, and they have the medicines.
Yes, that's what they do. That's really kind of their piece in society. They have other jobs, but that's a huge part of who they are in society is the shamans and whatnot that you've talked about before. And now we just popping pills,
plant medicine,
synthetic pills.
Certain things that were women's business. Plant medicine was women's business. I mean, there was men too, but like it's women's business. Weaving, women's business. Midwifery, women's business. These are women's spheres that men they're there on the margins, but like the farther back in time you go, like that stuff is it's flat out women's prerogatives, And so like, and that's all the stuff that's getting chastised or shut down and all of it.
Well, since we're at the 140, almost 2-hour mark, I think we probably should kind of wrap it up with maybe just saying how taking away this aspect of our lives, I think, has been very detrimental to modern day society. And you were saying backstage about how you feel religion is important. I'm kind of like here and there with it, but I think that it would be important for people who are religious to bring back this sacred part, the divine, the feminine part of worship, to bring back some balance.
Yeah, I mean, it can be found within Christianity. Like, the Catholics have the Virgin Mary, and Virgin Mary is very much a watered down version of the Mother Goddess. She's got all the same symbols. She's called the Queen of Heaven, all the same iconography, Virgin Mother. I mean, this is like the classic tropes. And and she's central to Catholic traditions. Even if she's not called a deity, she's still at the cultural level absolutely central to everything for the Catholics. They totally pray to the Virgin Mary to intercede on their behalf to God. She is the friendly, accessible part of the divine. And when the Protestant Reformation comes along, sure, they break free of the Catholics. That's great. But like, I was raised Protestant, so I'm sort of biased in that direction. But they totally knocked the Virgin Mary even farther off her pedestal. They the Protestants are even worse. Like they totally don't even pay attention to the Virgin Mary at all. Like she is clearly just the whole Bible
they denigrated her.
True, but like we're not going to pay any attention at all to the Virgin Mary as the mother of God. And so they're even worse about the feminine divine. And you see it in our relationship to nature. You see it in our man versus nature, man separate from nature, and the way we've treated women. And so we need to bring the women of the world. I wrote this book for my daughters. I've got 2 daughters. I want them to be acquainted with
I love that.
This idea awesome. that there's so much more empowerment to be had. And now it was a technology revolution, the Bronze Age, that shifted the gender relations previously. And now we're going through this profound technology change again. And we don't even know where we're going to end up. And now gender roles are changing again. And so now it's women that have the opportunity to reassert themselves. And I think the key is economic independence, women building matriarchal businesses where women recognize that your marriages may or may not last, people. Like, look around. Like, idealizing a lifelong nuclear family and nuclear marriage is just not realistic. But women can back each other up, and they can have women-owned businesses, and women can have their independence that way by having each other's backs and keep the good men around. It's not to say don't get married and stuff, but like recognize that half the men are going to be shysters. You want to get rid of them, and so keep the good men around and but have each other's backs as women, as sisters, and build women businesses that can comport with motherhood, and not just try and squeeze yourself like a square peg into a round hole of traditional men's businesses and men's office environments. Like build new businesses where the women set, the tone for the day-to-day workplace culture, and the childcare is part of that. And then the kids grow up fast anyway. So yeah, I think that there's just, we can change how things are and that women can reassert themselves again. So, but it's not going to happen quickly.
We have to take it. No, but we have to assert ourselves because, it's never given. Nothing is ever given. We have to take it. Knowledge. And that's why I think knowledge and being empowered with this kind of information can really help combat a lot of the stereotypical things that we've been taught as Christians, that we're beneath or lower than.
I know a Christian conservative can always go back to the Bible and Adam and Eve and say, this is why we're going to have a nuclear marriage, nuclear family marriages, patriarchal marriages. Like, actually, no, we don't actually have to do that. Human society, we've got 2 million years of human history, and most of it was tribal matriarchies, not nuclear family patriarchy.
Right, this is just a drop in the bucket. So I think it's time that we kind of turn things around. I really think it's needed. Anyway,
I think so too.
I think that's probably it. Unless you have, do you have anything else?
I think we should wrap it up. It's been 2 hours. I think I'm talked out.
But this was excellent and really exciting, and I would love to have you back to dive more in, and hopefully I'll be further through the book. But to go into the Garden of Eden story, maybe even some divine counsel, other stuff like that, I think would be a lot of fun. All right, y'all. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to wrap stuff up and going to handle some of the business stuff that we got to do for the channel. So y'all, if you believe that denying the divine feminine is not bad for society, you're wrong. Removing her from the modern day world has caused a lot of damage. And I think that it's time that we take back what's ours. Yes, I will say rise up. And if you need to, we'll get that goddess energy. Let's pull that. Let's just pull that warrior energy and just start kicking ass and taking names and getting what's ours. And ultimately that's going to help the vulnerable. That's going to help marginalized people. It's going to help everybody, even men, because men suffer too because of the patriarchy. So just as a whole, I think it's going to be better. Anyway, if you are looking for more knowledge and information about the Mother Goddess and beyond, I think you definitely should pick this book up, The History of the Goddess from the Ice Age to the Bible. Ed Dodge, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Can't wait
Ryan.
to see
It's been
you.
great.
Yeah, I can't wait
wait
to
to do
get
it
you back
again.
on here. We'll talk behind stage. I want to shout out to our Patreons. The Bible Says What? Kathy Cotton, Cindy Plaza, Deborah Grace, Sunny Shell, Aaron Coalson, and Phil Calderone. Y'all help the dream. You help put the dream together by funding us. We truly appreciate it. And Wes and all the producers and people backstage, we love you so much. Thank you. All right, y'all. I'm going to catch you later. This has been another episode of Women's Atheists Unloaded here on Skeptic Haven. Thank you for joining us, and we're going to see you soon. Bye-bye.
I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up.
I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. Everything I do so instinctive and so passionate. Every word I move so descriptive like an adjective. I got a vendetta against people who patented being negative when you should be getting after it. I got facts over tracks, this and that, spitting slow, spitting fast. I could roast, I could gas, think I'm okay at last, but I don't know if that can erase all the past and the pettiness. A reflection of the emptiness, hilarious. You think you're worth my time, you're delirious, mysterious, because you are behind a fake exterior.